Okay, so let's talk about thumbnails. Thumbnails are small drawings that you use to test out different compositional ideas before you go onto a canvas like this. So you're starting out in your sketchbook. You begin by, you have to define the edges of your picture plane. So the canvas that you're going to be painting on is the picture plane. And if we're testing out a composition, we need to be placing things within the rectangle, thinking of that canvas, not just placing floating objects, okay? So just drawing objects without the confines of that rectangle, that doesn't help you decide on any compositional ideas because you don't know where you'll be placing them within the canvas. So first start by defining the edges of your canvas. Then what I'm going to do is actually map in some third lines. So my rationale here is that I'm thinking of the golden ratio or the rule of thirds, where I can begin to align objects within my composition with some of these third lines. This is going to help me find an interesting composition to be working with, and also a composition where the eye can be moving around the canvas. That is our goal, that we keep the eye moving around the canvas and that we create an interesting scene. What we want to avoid is just putting an object right in the middle. That becomes a bullseye. So let's begin to map some things in. And within each of your thumbnail drawings, you want to be testing out different things. Okay, so you can try zooming in, zooming out, use different arrangements of objects. Okay. And even on the thumbnail scale, I'm doing things like I'm running these plumb lines, checking where things line up. I'm paying attention to negative space. I'm checking the angles on my objects. So I'm getting an understanding of these objects on this small scale in my sketchbook before I start committing paint to canvas. So that's another great thing about thumbnails, is you're getting familiar with your subject matter and you're using your sketchbook as a kind of place to experiment with different visual ideas. So I'll walk you through drawing at least this one thumbnail together, and the rest of this will do a kind of time lapse so you can see me create other thumbnails. Alright, so let's also kind of put a background line in there. So that's kind of describing where the curtain, or not the tablecloth, there's a drapery of white tablecloth. That's kind of where it's meeting the table surface. So I've kind of placed my objects. I'm keeping in mind these third lines. I've kind of put my sphere on this one. The cube is going near there. My cone is running up with that third line. And then the next step that you want to take for your thumbnails is that you map in the dark shapes or the shadow masses. Okay, so that's the overall shadow shape. And that's going to give you both the dark shapes and the light shapes. So that is an essential part of composition as well, understanding how these dark shapes and light shapes interact. So I'm going to start to map in my shadows, and I'm actually putting my pencil more kind of on its side. I'm just massing in these shadows fairly quickly. Now on this thumbnail scale, you don't have to get super detailed. You don't have to go in and put in that occlusion shadow and core shadow. At the very least though, you want to have the major shadow masses and the kind of shape of the shadows. so that when you squint at your thumbnail, you can kind of see clearly what the shadows and light are doing. Okay, so I got the shadow mask in that sphere and the cast shadow. I will pop in a little bit of darkness on the edge of the sphere so you can see where that ends, and I'll do this on the cube as well. Okay, and then on the cone, shadow mask kind of looks like that. Let's put that in. And then also the cone's cast shadow, I'm going to double check the angles in that shadow. It comes up a little bit more. So let's mask that in. All right, and then let's also, in the background, this area gets a little bit darker up in here. Let's see, there's kind of a drape to this. Okay, and then maybe something like that. It does get a little bit darker through here, which is nice because this is very bright and white. That cube is catching a lot of light. This part of the sphere is catching a lot of light, and having this part of the background be a little bit darker is going to help those light shapes pop out. So that's a good example of how the dark and the light go together. The dark is part of what makes this light pop out. So we really want to consider that in our compositions, how the dark shapes and light shapes are interacting. Okay, so that's one little thumbnail. You can see it's not a super refined drawing, but I'm understanding where I'm placing my objects, and I'm understanding the shadow masks, the dark shapes, and the light shapes and how those go together. Now I'm going to experiment with several more compositions, and we'll see what one I end up liking and using for my canvas. When creating thumbnails, each thumbnail composition should explore a different idea. You can zoom in or zoom out on your objects. You can try vertical or horizontal compositions. You can work from different scenarios of objects. You are still actively observing the still life setup, but how you decide to frame that setup makes all the difference. Make sure to map in your shadow masks for every thumbnail. Value is essential to composition. Keep in mind, we are working on observational drawing and painting skills. Don't try to make up objects for this project. Here are my finished simple object still life thumbnails. A few things I want to point out as you begin your own. Make sure you're starting by defining the edges of your picture planes. That's the edges of your canvas. So you're not creating a thumbnail if you're just drawing floating objects. That's not helpful for having you try to understand what's happening compositionally. To understand the composition, you need to define the edges, okay? Next thing, so when I go to draw in my thumbnails, I'm also mapping in my third lines. That goes with the rule of thirds and the golden ratio. It helps you create interesting compositions. You can align different objects with the third lines. And it helps you also avoid just putting something right in the middle, which can be really stagnant and boring. You want to make sure that you're also mapping in the dark and the light shapes. And that also for these different compositions that you have distinct compositional ideas in each one. So you're not just repeating the same idea over and over again. Rather, you can try vertical compositions. So like here, you can try horizontal compositions. You can zoom out, you can zoom in, you can draw different scenarios of objects. So you'll have different options to work from. I have these two different scenarios I was working from. You could do even more. And you can also see how in these two right in here, I'm working with the same scenario of objects. The objects are arranged in the same way, but by zooming in this upper one, it has a really different effect. So you should have 4 distinctive compositional ideas that you're trying out before you go to your canvas. So the idea is to kind of sort out your compositional problems in your sketch pad quickly with the thumbnails rather than having to repaint something later. You can also see my still life setup in the background. Now, I'm providing you with photos to work from for this simple object still life, but you can keep this in mind for if you want to set up still lifes on your own at home. I have a small table that I've put my still life on. I've created a draped background to control the light, and mainly and importantly, you might not be able to create the draped background, but I'm lighting it with a simple desk lamp. Now, I'm providing directional lighting, so it's being lit from the side, not just from above. And that gives me a distinctive light side and a distinctive shadow side, which is what you are, it's a great scenario for still life painting. It gives you great light and shadow shapes to work with. And it makes your life easier as a painter versus if you just have too much lighting or if everything's too dark. So even just having a simple desk lamp is going to be a great tool for painting at home. Okay, that's it for thumbnails. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to message me.